So the first thing I'll report to you is I am confident we'll retake the majority in the United States Senate. I have absolutely no confidence level on what size that majority will be. As the chairman and I made one promise when we walked into that building, is we will win the state of Montana come hell or high water, and that is going to come to pass. We are going to win the state of West Virginia. I feel very confident about Ohio as well, just slightly less confident than, say, Montana, and Montana just slightly less confident than the state of West Virginia, but that is not to say I'm not confident about those three. After that, it gets certainly much more difficult to predict, but I do think it's worth just stepping back and seeing what this cycle looked like it might shape up to be at the end of 2022. The landscape for us after Steve was elected chairman the week following the November elections, and we were looking through the map, considering what we need to do to be successful. And doing our postmortem on why we did not have the success that many of us had hoped for in 2022 was that we needed to be much more active and aggressive about shaping the playing field. That is, to recruit strong candidates who can win primary and general elections, and disrecruit candidates who cannot and would interfere with a smooth path to for our primary candidates to be general election candidates. We had a great partnership with President Trump. It was one of the first meetings that we had following the chairman's election and us taking over the building in January, was to walk through some of these key races. And it was critical we could not mess up our three red states, the three states where we have the strongest opportunity with Democrat incumbents that should not be there. They don't look like any of the others. These are states Trump wins overwhelmingly, supermajorities in the Republican state legislature, every constitutional office holder a Republican. But due to either weak candidates or messy primaries or a combination of the above, we have fallen short consistently in West Virginia, Montana, and Ohio. So job number one was to get Governor Jim Justice into the Senate race in West Virginia. We believe that happened. That would head off a potential primary that was shaping up between Patrick Morrisey and Alex Mooney, which the combination of that certainly would have been a death march, and it would have guaranteed that Joe Manchin would run for re-election. It was our belief if Justice got into the race, Joe Manchin would not run for re-election. And that's exactly what happened, and we've spent $5,000 in 2024 in the state of West Virginia as a result. Yes. I don't even know what that $5,000 was. It was probably a couple nights at the Greenbrier or something, but yeah. And then fast forward to Montana, which was appearing to be a likely primary between Congressman Ryan Zinke and Congressman Matt Rosendale, which would have been a similar scenario and would have set us up for a very difficult general election. We first sat down with Congressman Zinke. He recognized that that was not in the best interest of the order. He's a great patriot. We talked about who might be the strongest candidate if he was not going to run, and came up with the idea of combat veteran Navy SEAL Tim Sheehy, also a successful entrepreneur in Montana. We secured Trump's endorsement for him. Matt Rosendale was in the race for a week before deciding he had greener pastures elsewhere, and that was a futile mission. He endorsed Tim Sheehy. We got a Rule 11 from the state party and cleared the primary field, and we're now in a position where we're consistently polling just outside the margin of error. Although I would caution, the Democrats are going to extreme lengths, at this point in time to try to still put that race in the right track. We just caught a Democrat Senatorial Campaign Committee staffer who had to be fired yesterday trying to tamper with a ballot drop box on one of the reservations, was caught on video surveillance, and they had to fire him. And that's really just the beginning of the sort of things that we're seeing going on in Montana. So we need to be extremely vigilant and aggressive, because they really are going to any and every extreme length in the state of Montana to hold on to John Tester. It's going to be the most expensive race in Senate history on a per vote basis, well over $200 million. Then we move to Ohio. I'm taking up too much of Wink's time here, but we move on to Ohio, and we see the exact same polling pattern for Bernie Moreno as we did for J.D. Vance post-primary. Down double digits, closing to within single, and now moving to a slight 2 to 3 point lead in our internal polling. And this is with the exact same pollster that did J.D. Vance. And of course, J.D. Vance went on to win by 6 points. We feel very comfortable with the trajectory of that race. It seems to be well positioned to mirror the results of the presidential election, albeit somewhat closer, but we're in a stronger place at this point in time with Trump on the ticket in a state that Trump's going to win overwhelmingly, Ohio, than we were in 2022 with J.D. Vance. The next piece here I'll just touch on briefly, although I think it's the area that probably actually deserves the most scrutiny. It's really going to decide both the presidential race, outcome of the presidential, as well as the size of a Republican majority, and that's the blue wall states. And right now, Chuck Schumer is a little bit like Humpty Dumpty sitting on the blue wall. I don't know if he is going to fall off this cycle, but boy, are the foundations there cracking. Every week, the polling I get back, at any given moment, one of those 3 candidates is up, a point, and then the other 2, one of them's tied and one's down a point, and they flip on any given week. Those 3 races are just tighter than a new pair of shoes. The next place we move to, of course, is the Sun Belt, and Sam Brown's numbers in Nevada have been lagging Trump's more stubbornly than other states, and a lot of this, I think, that's been a place where folks who always looked at Nevada as always a bridesmaid, never a bride. So it's been hard to get the level of investment that I think the state and the opportunity deserves. That's now more righted, and Sam's numbers are starting to converge much more closely with the president's. And I think many of you have probably read some of the coverage here and what we're seeing with the early vote and the mail-in ballots in the state of Nevada. We are at a place we have not been as Republicans in that state, where the Democrats' firewall in Las Vegas is not what it's ever been before. The rural votes we are swamping the vote with the early vote there. So what remains certainly to be seen is where are the indies going to fall? How much are we pulling? How much are we pulling forward relative to Election Day? But everything we can see suggests that we are on track for a very strong turnout and a strong victory. And the Trump campaign has always seen their polling showing Trump especially strong in Nevada. It's one of the states they've had the most confidence in the battlegrounds, and we've seen similar things in our polling. And of course, we just so narrowly lost that race in 2022. Arizona, Trump's going to win that state the most by any of these battlegrounds. The question is, will that margin be great enough to bring Kari Lake along? The polling there, some of the polling is very erratic, but the private polling is consistently very close, with her just trailing a few points. But it's probably where you are going to have the greatest spread between our presidential candidate and our Senate candidate. But again, you might also see some pretty strong margins there. The polling there for Trump is anywhere of reliable private polling of him being up from 2 to 6 points. If it's closer to 6 than the 2, that probably suggests that those results are modeling a higher turnout that would have a really good chance of bringing Kari Lake along. I would leave with this, 68 out of 69 Senate races in 2016 and 2020 mirrored the results of the presidential race. Now, I think we're going to have Senate races and presidential races close enough in many of these states, especially those blue wall states, where it is not inconceivable at all where you could have Dave McCormick win by 1/4 point and Trump lose by 1/4 point, or vice versa in any one of these 3. If you look at the difference in performance between the top of the ticket on the Republican side for president and a Republican candidate for Senate, in 2008 that was just under 5 points. It has stair-stepped down every single presidential cycle to an historic low of 1.6% in 2020. I expect that will even be tighter when we see the final results in 2024. But it is going to potentially be, with all of the polling I'm looking at, Wink probably is seeing something pretty similar here, that these races, unless we see someone really break out here, just could not be closer in these states. And 1/4 or 1/2 point might easily separate the performance between a presidential candidate, a Senate candidate, or a House candidate down ballot. We are fortunate to be in a position going down the stretch due to a new advertising strategy and a mistake by the Democrats that opened up a new pathway for us to use our dollars in a more strategic manner. Democrats, I think, asked the FEC for permission for something they didn't think the FEC would give us permission for. And as a result, we're able to use JFCs, not to get into too much arcane finance here, but for our fundraising advertising, which is much like our campaign advertising in many ways. And as a result, we've really in a position now in nearly every single one of our competitive battleground states where we have parity in weight of messaging in the month of October, which is something Republicans have not had probably since going back to 2016 or before. In fact, there's more Republican dollars being spent in battleground races than Democrat dollars in 2024, the exact inverse of the situation we were in 2022, which is why, in part, I think you're starting to see the real movement in the public polling of the presidential ballot number and the Senate ballot numbers really getting close to one another. They just needed to know they had a Senate candidate alternative. So with that, I'll turn it over to Wink. But we're at an exciting moment. It just couldn't be closer. Anxiety can't run higher, and that's as much as I can tell you.
Well, first, I'd like to say that it's been great doing this with you, Jason, for 2 years. We have different maps, for sure, both very tight, but structurally and strategically, I think that we both agreed on day one of last year that we had some industry-wide problems we had to address. They include what Jason talked about, candidate recruitment. We cannot have unelectable candidates win primaries. The map is far too tight for that to happen. Both of us committed to and have worked very, very hard at recruiting effectively to avoid that outcome. Candidate cash deficit, tremendous. I mean, it's apparent on its face. Every time you do a postmortem after last cycle, you go, I don't know, if we didn't get outspent 5-1 on the candidate level, maybe we would have had a shot here, right? Where in a world where super PACs might get to parity with each other, not being able to compete head-to-head on the candidate level can just kill you from the jump. So I don't think either of us ever thought we'd get to 1-1 on candidate cash, but we had to do better than 4-1 and 3-1, and maybe we can win it 2-1. So more hybrid advertising, more JFC advertising, making sure that our candidates are well cashed up has been a tremendous point of emphasis for both committees. And from an industry-wide standpoint, it has been successful. Both committees making it a priority. I hope this continues in the future. It's the only way we're going to have a shot at competing with this massive Democrat money machine that is tremendously frustrating. So, to the House map. Prior to 2020, the last round of redistricting, there were over 50 seats across the country that were won or lost on the presidential level by 5 points or less. Right now, after 2020 redistricting, there are 35. That is not a huge swath of seats. 35 seats comprise mostly the competitive nature of this majority. The battleground was identified from day one, which meant that in January of 2023, I could look across to the DCCC, and they could look across to us, and we could probably have a similar theory of what races we were going into. Now, I'm not sure they went to work until somewhere in the middle of 2023 over there, but they basically have shown us to have the same idea of the map. So we had to recruit perfectly. We had to make sure that our incumbents were shored up on cash, and we did that via something we call the $1 Million Mission. We made sure that our members of the conference gave money to the most vulnerable members first directly before they gave to the NRCC. That meant that they paid less in dues to us. It reduced our cash on hand. But this is an existential problem. If our candidates don't have the money, then we may not as well be there. So that worked tremendously. In fact, it worked for a while. We proved the concept in the first 6 months. I was pleasantly relieved that an idea worked. And then it kept working. And then Q3 came and Q4 came and it kept working. And we held this cash on hand average advantage among our patriots. And we just closed Q3 reports and we still have that cash on hand advantage. Our patriots have a $600,000 cash on hand average advantage to their Democrat challenger. That is a sea change. I certainly didn't expect it to last into Q4, but it has, and it's allowed our most vulnerable incumbents in very expensive media markets in LA and Detroit and Philadelphia and New York to build up walls of cash around themselves, and it makes it very hard for the DCCC to come recruit against them, and it makes it very expensive for the DCCC to pick up a recruit and say, I'm going to run you at 6,000 points into a very expensive market against a candidate who can say whatever they need to define themselves. So that was a point of success. The bad news about that is that we weren't able to execute that at scale for our challenger candidates. It is much easier to make sure that your friends in your conference are getting cash to you than it is to a challenger candidate. So at the moment, we sit at a more than $1.3 million cash on hand disadvantage among our candidates facing the most vulnerable Democrat incumbents. That is incredibly difficult. That is a much larger number. Believe it or not, it's smaller than it used to be, but that number is very difficult to overcome. So we have to continue to work towards that gap. But again, we're doing hybrid advertising. We're being much more efficient with our message. We're getting a lot more done at the candidate rate than we are on the outside. So that is something we did to address the environment. Another way we dealt with this very tight environment was dealing head-on with the issue of abortion. It was clear that enthusiasm and intensity in 2022 was driven in large part by the issue of abortion. And I think in large part our candidates skirted the issue, addressed it ever so barely, lightly, but didn't really get into the issue. So we took, again, a tight map gives you some advantages. You can be very intentional with 40 or so races, and you can say, what is your position on abortion? I would like for you to communicate three things. I would like for you to communicate your position clearly. I would like for you to do it with empathy. And I would like for you to explain your opponent's position. I would like for you to do those three things. And we are going to drill it with you nonstop until you're comfortable doing it. Now, everybody got to pick in their campaign where it made sense to do this and at what volume it made sense to do this, but everybody in a competitive race in 2024 is able to do that, and I think that's been a huge advantage for us. We just have to continue doing it. It's going to take time. So that leads us to where we are now. I think Jason described a national environment that is working to our advantage. I couldn't agree more. I have a slide that compares the generic ballot September of 2020 versus September of 2024, and the whole point is that the environment's better today than it was in 2020. Right? And Trump lost 2020 by 45,000 votes in a dozen counties across the country. That's how close it was. Well, the environment for sure is better. But then I updated that September 2020 generic ballot number to October 15th, 2020, and it was going the wrong way in every single swing state. In some swing states, the Democrats were gaining 6 points on that generic ballot. So I looked up what happened in October of 2020. COVID was happening. Donald Trump went to Walter Reed, came back to the White House. This is a very different time. We were in a better environment in September than we were in 2020. We are now in an even better environment in October of 2024 than we were in October of 2020. All the while, our generic ballot in all the swing states is moving incrementally in our direction. So I will take all of those, along with my district level polling that tells me things are closing the right way, and I will give us the upper hand in keeping and growing the majority. So it has been a wild ride in the House. It has been an incredibly momentous and unpredictable national environment all cycle, but we are closing the right way, and I like where we're at right now.